Today we're going to go on a field tour. So we're going to take the opportunity to look at cover crop work that's been done from central Oregon across southern Idaho and down into Utah. I'm Steve Hines. I'm with University of Idaho Extension in Jerome County. We really want to thank Western SARE for providing the grant funds to make this opportunity possible. Okay, this next presentation, we're heading into south central Idaho. Myself, along with Jason Thomas, and he is an entomologist by training. Check out his YouTube channel, Insect Hunter. And to give you just a little bit of background on this particular project, this is a producer that we've worked with quite a bit. He actually happens to be on the webinar today. One of the questions that he's trying to answer here is, can he plant a cover crop mix with a winter wheat interseeded in it, graze that cover crop season long and get the income off of that cover crop, and then have the winter wheat go through the winter and come back next spring and produce a viable cereal crop? And so that's really what we're looking at here. And one of the questions came up when the cattle first came onto this particular 20-acre piece early on. The producer had a lot of cattle spread everywhere, so the cattle were pretty well able to eat whatever they want, and they really liked that wheat component, and they grazed it fairly significantly, and the producer was pretty concerned about whether or not the wheat was even going to regrow and come back. And so as we take a look at this piece of wheat here, at this one plant, you can see that it is starting to regrow, put on some new leaves. Now this is winter wheat, understand, planted in the spring, so it did not vernalize. So this is not going to elongate the shoots. It's not going to go reproductive this summer. And that's the whole point of this particular study. So we're getting some new regrowth. You can see on these stems here where they were grazed previously, but this winter wheat was small enough that the growth point was still down in the crown. It wasn't up high like you would see in something that had started to elongate, was going reproductive, where the cows would come in and eat the reproductive piece off. They basically just grazed this like they would any kind of a perennial grass and then moved on. And you can see that this wheat is coming back pretty well, and this is actually a nice looking field now of winter wheat with a lot of brassica still mixed through it. Now the grower will come back in and they'll graze this particular piece 2 or 3 more times yet this year, and then get the cattle off of it so that the wheat isn't overgrazed and it has plenty of energy going into the winter. And these are fairly significant winters up here in this valley. High elevation, cold, can be significant amounts of snow. And I think it shows a lot of potential to get 2 cash crops essentially off of a single planting. And the other thing is that in this particular area, this field had been barley for 3 years in a row after it had come out of alfalfa. I mean, a pretty much rotation crop limited to alfalfa, barley, and then perennial pasture up here, and trying to find something else that'll work, that'll be profitable for the grower, add the soil health component, and break up some of the same crop-on-crop issues is going to only benefit the growers and all the growers throughout this valley.
But he grazed this whole 20 acres for a couple days. He's got about 100, and he had about 100, at that time I think 35 head, cow-calf pairs I should say, 135 pairs out here. He was grazing the entire thing, and then based on the suggestions of the university folks, he did split the field in half, and he put, actually that's about 1/3, 2/3, about where that wheel line is. If you walk over there, you'll see there's a line. He grazed that side of it, I'd say like 90%. I mean, it was to the ground, the wheat was. They took the wheat right to the ground, and I thought we probably had lost that because I didn't figure it would regrow. He took this, I would say, I don't know, Steve, what would you say, maybe 60 to 75%. I mean, he grazed this pretty hard too, but not quite as hard as that other side. This has been 10, 12 days of regrowth from a very hard grazing.
Starting heavy right now when this is growing great guns. Later it's going to slow down, especially these cool season grasses, and so you've got to be able to bring in enough cows initially and then adjust those numbers throughout the growing season so that you've got enough to get it early, but you're not beating it down later in the season, especially on a deal like this if you're going to try and come back with a grain.
Like after 3 days, they're going to come and hit it again, especially the winter wheat, and so trying to move them in those 3-day rotations would be better, because then they're not going to come back and eat the same thing they ate 3 days ago. Is if he manages it right, he could wean the calves in October whenever he weans, and then bring them back and put his calves out here for a little while too. To me, it'd be really good feed to put weaned calves on, and they've already been exposed to it, so I wouldn't be so worried about bloat or any of those issues. When I've seen rashes and turnips that the cows really like, they like to eat it in the fall after they freeze a little, and then they'll pull these out and eat them. And so it'll be interesting to see what they do as the season progresses. They might actually come and cherry pick these out of the field instead of the oats. Once they start to frost a little bit, then they get sweeter. Right now they're a little spicier.
All right, thanks, Jason. And I had mentioned in there that was high elevation. It's about 4,850 feet, something about like that, up at that particular farm. So we're going to move south now and look at another little study that we've got going. We started working about 4 years ago with a particular producer, and they were interseeding cover crop into their pivots of corn, and that corn was on 22-inch rows. And through that study, it works, and they've done well with it. And I had been doing some reading on some wide row work that they had been doing in other parts of the country. And most of the corn grown here in this valley is for silage. Maybe 10 or 15% goes for grain. So we started asking the question, can we grow silage corn on wide rows, not hurt the yield, and have a good, viable either grazing cover crop or soil armor type cover crop when that silage comes off in September? And so we set up this little study, and it has 3 treatments. We used a standard 30-inch row on center as the check, which is pretty common around here, either 30s or 22s. We chose 30s with no cover crop interseeded. And then we did twin rows. One treatment was twin rows on 60-inch centers, and the other was twin rows on 44-inch centers. And so everything was planted at the same population, approximately 40,000 plants per acre was our goal. And so Jason will run this little video here, and you can kind of watch this grow through the growing season. The corn was planted on May 8th. It's a 99-day corn. And so here we are in July 22nd. The cover crop was planted on June 26th, and I just used a chest type fertilizer spreader to spread this out across the field, kind of simulate what would happen if you were to fly it on, which several producers in this area do. The seed wasn't worked in at all, just sprinkler irrigated, just let the sprinkler drops kind of work that seed into the ground a little bit. We think we need to improve on that. And here you can see as we're getting into the middle of August that cover crop's really starting to come. That cover crop mix, it was put on about 25 pounds to the acre, and it consisted of crimson clover, yellow sweet clover, a radish, and an annual ryegrass. And as you look at this, I mean, there's certainly some weeds in there, but not anything like I thought it would be. Now, this was a Roundup Ready technology, and so we did apply glyphosate actually twice before seeding down the cover crop. And we did our harvest September 18th, and so here we are a week or two before harvest. And you can see whether the 44 or 60, that's really started to cover in the control up there at the top right. I mean, there's a few weeds in there. There's just not much on that soil, as opposed to our wide row stuff has really got a lot of material growing in there. That soil's covered. There's a lot of potential feed in there. And so here we are on September 14th, which would have been 4 days before we came in and harvested this. This is the first year of this study. We're going to do it again this next year. This study was conducted at the Kimberly Research and Extension Center farm. We're doing it small scale before trying to move it out onto a producer's pivot to upscale it a little bit and see how it works in the real world. So here we are after harvest, and this would have been about a week or so. You can see there on the top corner there where it was just a standard 30-inch row, no cover crop. That soil is open. There's some weeds in there, but not much else. but you can see whether it's on the 60-inch centers or the 44-inch centers that there's material in there. You could graze that, or that soil is already armored. We have some pretty strong winds in this area, and soil erosion is a concern. And I did take forage clippings before harvest, and I'll talk about those results here in just a minute when we get to the end of this video. But I think it's very telling, especially for those of you who are interested in the soil health and soil armor aspect of cover crops. So here we are at the end of October. It has frozen several days by this point in time, but you can see that field with the 30-inch, the check treatment there is just open. There's just nothing there. The weeds that were growing there froze out. So there's essentially nothing there to graze, and there's nothing there to protect that soil. There's nothing there to catch the snow, but you can see whether it was 22s, or excuse me, the 44-inch on center or the 60s on center, that there's stuff there. You could graze that, or you certainly have good soil armor heading into winter. So I'm really excited about what we learned the first year as far as setting this up, and I think it really has some potential. You know, you could even graze that and then still have some soil armor as you're heading into the winter, depending on how you manage that. So quickly, just talk about the results and what we found on that. So the standard 30-inch check on that field averaged 30.7 tons. The 60-inch on center yielded 27.1 tons. The 44-inch on center yielded 34.7 ton. So from the statistical analysis, there is a significant difference between the 44-inch on center and the 60-inch on center, but neither of those are significantly different from the check, which fell kind of right in the middle of them, which was interesting. I can't really explain yet why the 22s would do better than the 44 or the 60s. The 44s would have done better than the 60s. In my mind, I thought that they would get more sunlight, more solar energy, kind of spaced out a little bit more. But again, this is 1 year worth of data, and we'll see what happens again this next year. The cover crop part of that deal on the 60-inch center was, and now this is dry matter, 0.91 tons to the acre. And on the 44-inch was 0.58 tons to the acre. But there was enough variance between the individual plots that there showed that there was no insignificant difference. But again, that's on a dry matter basis, keep in mind. So, somewhere, if you're kind of average those out, somewhere about 3/4 of a ton per acre dry matter of either feed or definitely some soil armor headed into the winter. So that's kind of what we found on that one this year. Interesting, and looking forward to studying this out this next year. So the final piece that we're going to look at today, the same producer from the first video, we'd worked with him, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago on another project. And one of the questions coming out of all of that, without getting too far off in the weeds, as it were, is how much regrowth, if you're grazing cool season cereals in a cover crop mix planted in the spring, and you're grazing those all summer, how much regrowth can you actually get out of those cool season cereals? And it seemed like the traditional school of thought was, well, once they start to elongate those stems, and they're going to be done. And we really didn't know. So we set up quite a study, and you're going to see just the very end of this. This was a 2-year study conducted at 2 different research centers for the university, one high elevation at the research ranch up in Salmon, and then also at the research farm at Kimberly. We decided our treatments were to cut them 1 time a year, 2 times, 3 times, and 4 times, just to simulate maybe some different kinds of grazing practices that you might see. What we're going to look here is the last cutting of the 3 cut and the 4 cut, just to kind of look how those cereals look later in the season. Now, these are not in mixes, they're individual species. Keep in mind that the whole idea of this is to see how they might function in a mix. So on the triticale here, one thing we found is once triticale wants to try to go to boot and then seed, it just wants to be done. Triticale worked really well if you wanted to graze it once or twice. And then the forage oat, the Italian ryegrass, we also had winter wheat in this. And the winter wheat, keep in mind, was spring planted. The forage barley was also a winter barley. The idea was that those would stay vegetative and continue to grow really well and not head. That was the case for the winter wheat. That was not the case for the forage barley. Here you can see the winter wheat only cut 3 times. This should have been cut or grazed before we came back on it because it had gotten tall and stemmy or leafy and kind of lodged and laid down. And the forage barley on this cut here, we're looking at Kimberley. So this would have been August 14th is the date. You can see that the triticale is done on the 4-cut system. On this would have been August 21st at Kimberley, and it was just done. It gave its all before this point. So if you want season-long stuff, triticale is probably not your grass. Here's the Italian ryegrass, and keep in mind this is ryegrass. It's not cereal rye. It really started coming on when the summer heat came on, and this was our last cut, and we probably could have cut that 1, if not 2 more times, but that was kind of outside of the scope of our study at that point in time. Here, the winter wheat. As we started getting later into the season, there was some disease starting to show up in it a little bit. And we had a vole problem in this field later in the season also that caused us some issue. On the forage barley, it about gave its all by the time we got to the end of the season, but overall, it still did really well. In fact, and I'll give you the data, just some quick data right at the end of this, but overall, only the forage oat did better than forage barley. But kind of what you can see out of this is regardless, you can get more than 1 or 2 grazings out of these cereals, but you have to stay on top of them. If you do let them start to go reproductive, then they are going to want to start slowing down and not regrowing as well. Now this particular oat here, this was Everleaf, I believe, was the variety of this one. It just season long really continued to put on vegetation and grow and do well. And of course, anybody who's grazed oats in the past will tell you that oats make pretty good grazing forage. So just quickly on this one here, I just want to show you some information. There's a lot more going on here than what I want to talk about. But as you look at this particular slide here, so what we're looking here is species here that were cut 4 times. These are the cut dates up here. And on the total between 2 years and the 2 sites, looking across here, okay, and this is season long total, keep that in mind. Okay, on the forage oat, it put on little over 4,700, almost 4,750 pounds. This is green. Forage barley was 4,767. So you can see those 2 were very similar. The Italian ryegrass, not too far behind at almost 4,500 pounds. The winter wheat, just a little over 3,900 pounds. And then we get over here to the triticale at 4,200 pounds. And that comes out of, these first 2 cuts, but really that second cut is where the triticale, as you can see, was putting on its weight. But after it started getting some maturity to it, it just really dropped off. On the 3-cut system, again, 2 years, 2 sites, total yield on the 3-cut system. You can see that the forage oat really outpaced everything else at almost 5,800 pounds, again, green. The forage barley was a little over 4,100. Italian ryegrass was 44, just a little over 4,450 pounds, almost 4,000 pounds on the winter wheat. And then the triticale at a little over 4,300 pounds there. And you can kind of see on the 3-cut system that they grew a little longer. I think we were about 5.5 or 6 weeks between cuts. On the 4-cut system, we were about every 30 days. And so obviously they put on a lot more, but they got more mature and dropped off quicker. But they certainly still continue to produce on that. So just a little touch on something that's got a lot more data into it. And then here are several more folks who really helped us with this with the University of Idaho on this project. And I wanted to make sure and point them out as well.